Hi everyone, thanks for coming back for part 3. There's something else very important that's going on in the heavens, and I just want to thank Arthur Prudent once again for letting me know about this as well. This is a video by the channel is Liberating Ministries, but it's by Dale Sides, and I also want to thank Diana Jesus Servant for also letting me know about these videos. There's another one that he did previously, which was this one over here, and I'll put the links in the description box. But in the first video that I had watched, he was talking about these dual retrogrades that have been taking place simultaneously, and it's as if God has been drawing a circle around these two things. And the first one is it's right above Spica, which represents the first fruits. You have Jupiter making a circle in Virgo's womb, so it's like God is pointing that out. And that was from, well, it ended actually on September 9th, and Jupiter is about here now. And then there was another retrograde that took place in the constellation Leo, and this one was done by Mercury, and it was as if Mercury was drawing a circle around Regulus, pointing out that the king is coming. And this one over here, he was saying, points out that God's kingdom is coming. And then the other thing that he talks about in this video is not only were there are these two retrogrades that were making a circle, one in Leo around Regulus and one around the womb of Virgo by Jupiter, but there was another circle being drawn in the heavens, and this one is in the constellation Ophiuchus, and this was being done by the planet Saturn, and he's drawing, or the planet Saturn is drawing a circle right around the heel of Ophiuchus, which it's the heel of Ophiuchus that stomps on the scorpion. So this would be a fulfillment of Genesis 3:15, where it says, "And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed, and it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." This was believed to have taken place at the cross, but as I've mentioned before, I believe this fulfillment will actually occur when Jesus steps foot on the Mount of Olives, and the Antichrist is destroyed on the mountains of Israel. Okay, so I wasn't originally going to talk about all that, but I just wanted to explain it because I believe it all relates to why the moon is under the woman's feet, and why I believe that's important, and what I believe the moon represents. Because what I'm coming to realize, and have realized for a while, is that this seems to all be a battle between the sun and the moon, and that's where this pattern comes in, and why I wanted to explain this pattern. Okay, so what I've noticed is that there's a pattern that can be seen from the very beginning, from the book of Genesis, and it seems to be a pattern of sevens. And what's really amazing to me is that Leland Jones has come up with a pattern based on the Enoch calendar that's based on sevens, and it's based on cycles of 7 or Shemitahs. And then he's also worked in the Jubilee somehow, and I'm not sure exactly how this pattern works, but what's really amazing to me is how it seems to line up with this pattern that I noticed as well with the blood moons. And the way I noticed that there was a pattern here was when I was watching a video by Pastor Sandy Armstrong, and he was talking about types and typologies in the Bible, and how Jesus fulfilled the Passover, and how the Passover lamb was chosen on the 10th of Nisan, and then it was slain on the 14th of Nisan. And then, as we know, Jesus was crucified on the 14th of Nisan. And then the Feast of Unleavened Bread begins on the 15th of Nisan, and that's when Jesus was placed in the tomb. And then 3 days later, after 3 days and 3 nights, he rose from the dead between the 17th and the 18th. It was actually the 18th, just before dawn, that Jesus rose from the dead. And so I noticed that this pattern with the blood moons actually matches up with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It also matches up with the Psalms, and it was discovered by J.R. Church some time ago that there's a symmetrical pattern with the Psalms that actually begins with Psalm 111, and I've explained this before. It begins with Praise ye the Lord. The first 3 Psalms begin with Praise ye the Lord. And then in Psalm 14, there's no Praise the Lord at all in that one. Psalm 13 actually ends with Praise ye the Lord as well. And then starting with Psalm 115, they end with Praise the Lord. You see that again in Psalm 116. It ends with Praise the Lord. And then Psalm 17, which seems to represent the year 2017, begins and ends with Praise ye the Lord. And then from there on, it changes in Psalm 118 to giving thanks unto the Lord. First it was Praise ye the Lord, and then Psalm 118 begins and ends with giving thanks unto the Lord. Now, what's interesting is on this calendar over here, Leland Jones has determined the last 7 years, and from what I'm understanding, he did this based on the book of Esther, because King Artaxerxes was a type of Christ, and it was in the 7th year of his reign that Esther was crowned queen. But if you look at the verse numbers, you see that it's in 2:16, where it says, So Esther was taken into King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the 10th month of Tebet, in the 7th year of his reign. And then it's in verse 2:17 that it actually states that Esther was crowned, and it says, And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So it was the 7th year of the reign of Artaxerxes, and so he's starting this pattern of the last 7 years over here with 2010, because in the book of Daniel, it talks about the 62 weeks, and then after the 62 weeks, there's the last week, the last 7 years after that. And so this pattern starts with 2010. So this would be 2010 to 2011, and then you have 2011 to 2012, 2012 to 2013, 2013, 2014, 2014, 2015, 2015 to 2016, and then over here is the 7th year, which is 2016 to 2017. So this begins with 2010. And so what's interesting is if you go to the Psalms and you go to Psalm 110, it begins by saying, The Lord said unto my Lord, Sit at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. And so this is actually one of the reasons that a lot of people believed that Jesus was going to come back in 2010. And so I don't know if he's considered that or made that parallel at all, because I haven't watched enough of his videos, but I know that he's based this on the book of Esther, but I'm not sure if he's based it on anything else. But it's interesting that he's stating here that the Lamb has been on the throne since 2010, and now this would be the 7th year, and that's when the crown is placed on Esther's head. And incidentally, it just comes up in verse 17 in Esther 2:17, which looks like 2017. Okay, now if you go to Isaiah 66, you see this pattern over here beginning with verse 1, and it says, "Thus saith the Lord, the heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Where is the house that ye build unto me, and where is the place of my rest?" So this is a direct parallel to Psalm 110. And then this seems to be matching up with the years as well, because, as I mentioned earlier, this is verse 6, which seems to line up with perhaps the development of the Mark of the Beast system. And then this matches up with year 2017, which seems to be the year that the man-child will be born. Okay, so I've talked before about how the 14th of Nisan is when the veil was rent, and so in verse 14, a lot of times you see the renting being mentioned, or in chapter 14, it's in Exodus 14 that the Red Sea was parted. It's in Zechariah 14 that the Mount of Olives split. So this is all type and shadow of the veil being rent. But what I wanted to show you is that this pattern begins all the way in Genesis, and what this is ultimately about is DNA, because in Genesis 1:1 it looks like the number 11, and then in verse 4 it looks like the number 14. And I can try to explain this a little more later since I'm running out of time. But in verse 14 it says, "And God saw the light that it was good, and God divided the light from darkness." And over here in verse 1, this is a representation of the DNA, because over here it says, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth." And if you look at verse 2, it says, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the earth, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." And so the earth was dark and void. And if you look at this in the Greek, it actually says that the earth was the abyss. Okay, so in verse 14, there's going to be a separation between the light and the darkness. And then if you go to verse 14, you see the same thing is mentioned again. In verse 14, it says, "And God said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for days and years." So again, it's speaking of a division in verse 14. Okay, and then in verse 16, it explains that God made two great lights. The greater light, which is Jesus, to rule the day, because the sun represents Jesus, or Jesus is represented by the sun, and the lesser light to rule the night. So that would be the moon, or Satan. And he made the stars also, and he set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And then it goes on to say in verse 18, "To rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good." And the gematria for good is the number 17. But again, it's talking about a division taking place in verse 18. But if you notice, this is all one sentence, and it begins with verse 17. And I believe this lines up with the year 2017. but I'm about out of time, so I'll have to continue in the next video. Thank you.